Story is always brought to you by Vodafone. In a few weeks, Ghana may run out of time to secure an IMF executive board approval for a bailout, with experts warning that may trigger a complete economic collapse. It is becoming increasingly evident that Ghana can only avoid that fate if China agrees to grant us debt relief. Now, the faith of the economy rests with a high powered government delegation that is set to fly to the world's second largest economy by Friday, tasked with the job of convincing what the finance minister, Kenneth Friata, calls the big elephant in the room, China, to grant Ghana urgently needed debt relief. The rest of the bilateral creditors have all agreed to sit at the table, and they have made pledges already to negotiate a restructuring of the debt and, in some cases, a complete relief. But China, as the finance minister says, as you hear him pretty shortly, indicates is the only big elephant in the room. As the delegation departs, experts are warning officials to prepare for a long, tortuous battle with Chinese negotiators. China alone holds a third of Ghana's bilateral debt, and without their benevolence, it will be impossible to secure the IMF $3 billion bailout. Listen to the finance minister talk about the Chinese challenge.
We had the president of the finance minister in town. Last week we had some 10 or so parliamentarians, and today we have the two federal ministers with us. So clearly the relationship that you have built is yielding fruits. And it's at a very important time given where we are with the IMF program and how to make sure that it is successful. Mr. President, we have, as you know, in December, we're able to secure the staff level agreement in record time so that we set up the macro issues. And then the second part was working out a debt treatment, which, you know, last week we concluded with the domestic debt treatment and already began the discussions with the Paris Club, which is a very important part of ensuring that we get to the board by mid-March. The issue of the common framework has been problematic for Africa, Zambia, Ethiopia, Chad, and therefore in going into that, we're very categorical that it has to be fast-tracked, and therefore they have to set up their creditor committee very quickly. They've acceded to that, and we hope that that would happen quickly. The big elephant in the room, of course, is China, as to how China will comport themselves in that for comparability of treatment, because China wants to do a bilateral. We will be visiting China at the end of the week to really discuss how they come into the envelope as quickly as possible. The German Minister of Finance was clear that he will put his weight behind ensuring that everybody is in the common framework so that we move quickly. So we are looking for that support from them. China represents about a third of the loan, the 5.7 billion loan to the bilaterals. And so it's important that we engage them strongly, especially before the G20 meetings in Bangalore.
So that's the finance minister there talking about that challenge with China. And it's become even more challenging now because of the size of the debt when it comes to China. He talks about that also. But we're also hearing from experts tonight who are also warning about the difficulty with dealing with the China particular problem. The success of the delegation that is now about to leave the shores of Ghana to China, we expect this to happen by Friday, will pave way for an orderly restructuring of Ghana's external debt after the completion of the domestic debt exchange program. Professor of Finance at the University of Ghana, Professor Godfrey Bopwe, says government should expect a protracted external debt restructuring. He projects the IMF Executive Board might have to approve the bailout pending the conclusion of the debt restructuring itself.
Typically, it's easier restructuring the domestic debt, and we have seen what happened. Within 2 months, essentially, government was done. It's also because of the divide and rule approach, because the domestic creditors couldn't form one committee in order to negotiate from position of strength. But that same strategy will not work with our international creditors or external creditors. That won't work. So there is a high possibility that the IMF will give us a program end of Q1, because without that, with the dwindling international reserves, the country will be exposed and the city may come under cumulative pressure. So there's a high possibility that the IMF will give us a program even before the completion of the external debt restructuring. Why am I saying so? With the external debt, particularly when it comes to Euro bonds and the rest of them, look, it's not going to be that simple, because, in the case of the domestic debt exchange, because we didn't have a unified front, we couldn't negotiate from position of strength. We even didn't ask for the debt sustainability analysis, the projections, the assumptions, to interrogate it. But when it comes to the external debt, they will demand all those things. They will validate the assumptions underlying the debt sustainability analysis jointly done by the IMF and the World Bank. They will demand all of that. They will validate. They will look at the projection. They will look at the fiscal outlook. They will look at all those things before they will come on board. And therefore, if we are saying that we will have to complete that one before IMF will give us a program, that will be as difficult as asking fish to climb the tree. Okay, so chances are that the board will give us a program while negotiations are or continue for the restructuring of the external debt.
So that high-powered delegation leaving our shores to China at the end of this week, as the finance minister disclosed last night, what should they expect when they land in China and sit around the table with the Chinese negotiators? Well, we'll be speaking pretty shortly with the director of the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Ghana, Dr. Lloyd Amwa. But first, what are the facts when it comes to China's dealings with poor countries like Ghana when it comes to its debt and the lendings that it does? A few things we've been learning, and my colleague Kofi J joins me in the studio, and we've been working through trying to understand what this is, this beast, this machine called China, how it deals with the countries that is lent to. It's pretty scary. What do we know so far?
Right, so Evans, what we know is that China is more or less like the missing piece or in the puzzle of a number of debt talks underway in developing markets. China is the world's largest bilateral lender, but discloses little on lending conditions and also how it renegotiates with borrowers in distress. So we take, countries like Congo, for instance, when they wanted to restructure a debt burden of 1.3 billion owed to China. This is what China wanted in 2019. China only agreed on conditions of lengthening the maturities and increasing interest. So at the end of the day, instead of Congo paying 1.3 billion, their debt ended up increasing from 1.3 billion to 1.6 billion, an increase of more than 23%.
So you go to China and say, in Congo's case, I can't pay, I'm in distress like Ghana. They say, well, I can't do anything about it, but I can help you if you agree to pay me more interest and then you extend your maturity. So if it's supposed to mature fully, say in 5 years, I'll extend it to 10 years.
That's
but
the
you pay more interest in it. In the end, you pay them more.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
But you get relief in the interim.
Yeah.
So that's the Congo example. And if you look at the poorest countries who face like 35 billion in debt servicing payments official and private sector creditors with over 40% of that total burden alone due to China, according to the World Bank. So they are, in terms of the poor countries, they seem to be the single largest creditor when it comes to poor countries. Now, let's ask the question, does China really care when it comes to this matter? You're giving the Congo example, but there's more to it.
Yeah, so if you look at between 2000 and 2019, China has forgiven 23 interest-free loans. So mind you, they will only forgive you if the loan is interest-free to 17 African countries, including Ghana.
So since 2020, 2019, yes, China, they've forgiven some loans.
Interest-free loans.
But these are just interest-free loans to
Exactly.
17 African countries. The
Exactly.
question we need to be asking ourselves as a team begin to, pack their bags and leave, in terms of, and we'll tell you what our debt portfolio is when it comes to China specific, but the amount that we owe China, how much of that is interest-free, how much is not? Then that possibly could help you appreciate. If you look at this data, they may forgive you if it's interest-free, but if it's not interest-free, then you're in deep trouble. What else do we know?
Well, so we know that interest-free loans, for instance, account for less than just 5% of the 843 billion in Chinese loans commitment to 165 governments globally between 2000 and 2017. So in a span of almost 2 decades, China has forgiven only, so if you look at Ghana, for instance, in a span of 2 decades, they've forgiven us just $201 million. If you look at,
they don't forgive much.
They don't forgive much.
Okay.
If it is interest-free, fine. But if you look at Zambia, they've forgiven Zambia in the span of 2 decades, $392 million. If you look at Ivory Coast, for instance, just 25 million. And Liberia, for instance, 22 million. So just like we said about the Congo example.
What about Zambia? Zambia is the most recent case, right?
Exactly. So they've forgiven Zambia in a span of 2 decades, just like I said, more than 300 million. But we know that there have been prolonged talks when it comes to Zambia's debt restructuring. China's position is that, so if you want us to forgive you, there is no forgiveness actually. Zambia wanted a write-down in terms of the debt portfolio, about 6 billion. China was saying, we can't do a write-down. All we can do is to prolong the maturity.
We'll increase the maturity for you. And to make the point, though, Zambia found themselves in the same position as Ghana. They wanted China to come to the table with some form of a pledge so they can go to the executive board for approval. It took them nearly 2 years.
2 years.
To secure that.
2 years. So they got the staff level.
Just like Ghana has secured it.
So they got the staff.
They were
level.
holding on to that for almost 2 years.
For 2 years, 2020 to 2023. So they are still in talks with China, and they want a write down. China is saying the best I can do for you is to.
China came to the table though, and the minute they came to the table, I think it was in August of last year.
Exactly.
They quickly. Zambia got the executive board approval. So the key thing, a lot rests on this delegation that is leaving to China. Their success will determine whether or not we get the executive board approval. Because as we know, Germany has been in Ghana, and it was the same event that the finance minister spoke a couple of weeks back. The finance minister for Germany was here. They were pledging on behalf of Europe that listen, for us we are okay.
Yeah, the Paris Club.
We are okay. Finance minister of Germany was calling out China publicly that come to the table and help Ghana out. The question is, can this group leaving get China to come to the table? But how much do we owe China?
Well, so if you look at our current external debt portfolio, it's around $29.2 billion, and it's 66.5% of our entire debt stock. So we owe China close to $2 billion, $1.7 billion we're talking about. Eurobonds, for instance, we owe 13.1 billion. Multilateral debt is about 8.1 billion. And Paris Club, so if you combine Germany, US, France, we owe them 1.9 billion.
It appears to me that as far as bilateral debt is concerned, China is the single largest
biggest,
holder.
exactly.
The biggest, okay, 1.7 billion. Kofi, thank you very much. As I said, we can now speak to Dr. Lloyd Amwa. He's a director of the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Ghana. Doc, thanks for your time here on Newsnight. This delegation that is about to fly out, the finance minister gives us a timeline for their journey. They're leaving at the end of this week. What should they expect when they get to China?
Well, they would meet a Chinese government that obviously is more or less focused on some of the key internal issues that China has been handling. For example, the COVID-free policy that they had to grapple with. And then also governance issues. The National People's Congress, which is the equivalent of Parliament, or of our Parliament, their Parliament, they call the MPC, is expected to sit, essentially, in March, the 5th of March. And so these are the questions that China is more or less engaged with. And of course, on the international front, the security issues with the U.S., and all of that, So they will meet a China that has its plate full and would have to more or less accommodate Ghana. But of course, Ghana is an old friend in many ways. We recall that when the Chinese were getting back into the international community after the 1965 Bandung Conference, it more or less, when it came to sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana was the first country that Joe and Lai and the team, including Chen Yi, who was then the foreign minister. Ghana was the first, if you like, black African country that China visited when it more or less was trying to get into the international system. So these are old friends. Of course, the circumstances have changed. The period when Joe and Lai and Nkrumah were around was more ideological. Now we are in the era of neoliberal capitalism, which others call globalization and all of that, where when it comes to engaging countries, you have a cost-benefit calculus. And so this is the backdrop, the background within which these two old friends, if you like, would have to deal with a thorny issue involving the Republic of Ghana. Yes, in terms of its economy and the massive strains that it is facing at this conjuncture or point in history.
How difficult do you expect this to be, this conversation about debt relief with China once we land on the ground?
Well, if you look at the literature, it's becoming very clear that the Chinese increasingly are applying very much commercial logic to the issues of finance, development finance, when it comes to countries like Ghana. And so, as your colleague rightly said, the Zambia example is classical. Zambia fell into the complications of debt and wanted China to come on board, but China was not going to simply, cancel the debt. Maybe 40 years ago, 50 years ago, China would have done that. But I think the circumstances are particularly different. China is more hard-nosed when it comes to these issues, And of course, with the Zambian example, the upshot of that was that, the Chinese, the Chinese were not happy with the Zambians and essentially, put on ice certain infrastructure projects that Chinese banks were involved in. So this is going to be, in many ways, tricky, and it's not going to be a walk in the park for sure. But of course, the underlying connections with Ghana, and especially given that Ghana is fundamentally an important country in West Africa. I mean, if you look at the data, Ghana ranks number one when it comes to Chinese projects over the long duration from 1956 to 2014. Ghana ranks number one when it comes to official development assistance projects and also, broader development finance projects. So Ghana is important, and again, when you look at the data, Ghana is the third most important country when it comes to value of development financing for the Chinese in West Africa. So all these issues might play into the discussions as the Ghanaian delegation speaks to the Chinese. And so let's see how it goes. Our negotiating power, what it is that we bring to the table, the mood in Jonanhai, as we call it. In other words, the seat of power in China. All of these things will play out as the two parties interact.
Doc, thank you very much. That's Dr. Lloyd Amwa, and Dr. Lloyd Amwa is a director of the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Ghana. Joins us with his thoughts on this. Last month, there was a very significant statement that was issued by many international non-governmental organizations, some of the world powers when it comes to the INGO space, including Oxfam, including Action Aid, and a host of others who are locally based as well, came together and issued an appeal to international creditors to Ghana to grant us debt relief. Since the issue that it was picked up by the global news wires, and many of the European countries as well referred to that in their talks also. I mean, I wonder, since that statement came out, significant statement indeed, has anything changed? I want to bring in right now the policy analyst with the ISODEC. They were part of those that issued this particular statement that went global on behalf of Ghana. And he joins us on the telephone line right now. He's with Integrated Social Development Center. Grateful that you could join us with your thoughts on this, Bernard.
Hello? Yes.
Hello, Bernard. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Grateful you could join me, Bernard Anaba. Ms. Anaba, tell me, so since that statement was issued by yourselves and a host of others, have you had any response from the global community about Ghana's debt situation?
Right. Thank you very much, and good evening to your listeners. I would say, no, we haven't heard that much concerning Ghana's situation. And, we have been busy trying to negotiate our way to the domestic debt exchange issue. So now that that is concluded, I believe we will now make this step to the international area, and also those issues will be looked at. But what I know is that in terms of one of our demands, that the government should stay on the default in terms of should not honor its debt service until the private creditors and our creditors in general come to the table. We know just last week the New York State Assembly and the Senate have proposed what they call the New York Taxpayer and International Debt Crisis Protection Bill, which is actually in line to force private creditors to come around the table to help developing countries as well as poor people to have some debt release. So that process is very significant because most of the debt that is contracted under private with private organizations are under the New York State law and also the UK, usually the UK law. So it is for this particular the New York State and the UK government to review their laws concerning these creditors to be willing to come and negotiate. But also on the issue of Ghana, already before the government indicated that they were willing to join the common framework treatment process, some of Ghana's creditors, such as the BlackRock, the Greylock Capital Management and others, have already formed a creditor committee and seem to have been ready to begin the negotiation with Ghana. And the other good thing is that significantly, China is often the biggest hurdle in this process. But in terms of Ghana's debt, we think that Ghana is not so indebted to China. So in this case, we'll be able to move forward even if the Chinese are not so willing.
Well, it turns out that not exactly, because as far as bilateral debt is concerned, China is the single biggest holder of our debt, $1.7 billion. A reason why the finance minister announced yesterday that they are sending a delegation to China to try and negotiate and get them to the table. Without them, it will be difficult for the IMF to give us that bailout we need in March. That is of key concern. I wonder if the power that you unleashed in that statement may come and possibly single out China, and just like the Germans are doing since last 2 weeks, each time they've met our government officials, have called on China to oblige. I wonder whether you consider a strategy like that also.
Yeah, definitely. That is one thing that we do, trying to call all the partners in terms of the private and bilateral creditors to come around the table. We often thought that China isn't going to be much of a problem from Ghana, but as you are saying, if that is a problem, then it is an issue for our advocacy to get them to come around the table. Yes.
Bernard, thank you very much. Bernard Anaba is the policy analyst with the Integrated Social Development Center, ISODEC. They were part of a host of other international non-governmental organizations, the superpowers when it comes to that arena of global campaign groups like Oxfam, like Action Aid, who all came together to issue that strongly worded statement asking the world to forgive Ghana's debt. In fact, cancel Ghana's debt. We'll get an update from him on this. You want to join us on Newsnight because we bring you the very latest from Parliament. Very interesting developments there before the Appointments Committee. Stay with us.